Hello. Let's see, maybe, am I going to sit? I guess I'm going to sit. Okay. I've never done one of these things before, so bear with me. Might be a little awkward at first. It is I think Michael chose me to host this particular track because it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I used to work for Tripwire. Worked for Tripwire for 6 years. Actually worked very closely with Gene Kim and some of the development of the Visible Ops book. Gene is, if you know Gene well, and obviously he did one of the keynotes this morning, he cares deeply about DevOps, but before that he cared deeply about audit and compliance. And so, of course, in this new world where we're trying to deploy software faster to our end users, those demands on the IT organization are, I guess, paramount. They're huge. But you need to be able to deploy new software in a secure way. And obviously, the faster you move, sometimes the harder it is to make sure that systems are secure and that you're able to prove compliance either to internal regulatory compliance guidelines that you have or external ones like PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, what have you. With that in mind, we've gathered today a panel of experts that have used Puppet and have extensive experience in audit and compliance across a variety of industries. I guess primarily financial, but that's not completely true because we've also got Trevor Vaughn here who does an extensive amount of work with the federal government in helping them comply with their many regulatory compliance issues and audit requirements as well. So my name is Scott Campbell again. I've been with the company for about 7 years. I head up various different parts of sales within the organization right now. And I guess with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Seamus. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, sure. So Seamus Birch. So I'm an independent consultant who basically consults into the financial services industry. I've worked for companies such as Deutsche Bank, Barclays Capital, Scotiabank, and Royal Bank of Canada over the last sort of 15 years or so. I focus primarily on development practices and how to improve those, and so it was a natural fit for me to start moving into how do you roll out Puppet at scale.
I'm Robert Grignon. I'm a senior solutions architect for TIAA. I've been there for about 2.5 years, and we were able to implement enterprise Puppet across all 12,000 nodes, multi-region, and had a good opportunity of a greenfield deployment. So we were able to test a lot of both worlds of implementing a legacy versus a brand new concept that was embracing a lot of security and compliance. So.
I'm Sean Millichamp. I work for Secure24. We're a managed hosting provider. I've been there for about 7 years now. Puppet user for 8. We use Puppet primarily on our Linux platform to manage all sorts of requirements, including security and compliance needs.
I'm Trevor Vaughn. I actually decided to, they let me crash the party, so it was very nice. I'm one of the co-founders of Onyx Point Incorporated. We're primarily government contractors, but we are a Puppet Services Gold partner, and we have done quite a bit in terms of getting different organizations compliant with various regulations. And I am also the primary development lead on the SIMP project, which is an open source framework for security compliance on Red Hat-based systems. Great.
Welcome. Thank you very much for participating. So first we're going to start with some security-related questions. Obviously you have your day jobs. You have to roll out software, maintain systems in production, what have you. But as you're going about thinking about how you manage production infrastructure and as you think about the software delivery process, how has the integration of security and security personnel and security reviews of that process and potentially code in the delivery cycle, how has that integration or how has the participation of security folks changed over the last couple of years? Start with you.
So I think it's about bringing security into being central to the development lifecycle, right? So previously they were kind of on the fringes. So you'd have a security team that was involved with, when you'd request to make a change, and then you'd have security approve those changes that you want to make to your production environment. And then, you'd make the changes as a developer or as a Linux admin. And then security would be involved again at the other sides, checking to see whether, the changes, no one's made changes that they weren't authorized to make, that there wasn't something happening. So security was always kind of on the outside. It was on the fringes on either side of the actual development activity that was happening or the change activity that was happening. Whereas now we're seeing security is now becoming more tightly integrated in with that actual change activity itself, so that they're there to assist in terms of making those changes.
And what do you think has prompted that? Has that been a requirement within the business, or have security requirements increased, or have you done that because you found that the integration of security teams into that process makes the ultimate lifecycle more efficient?
So it's definitely the latter.
Yeah.
So we previously had teams and teams of people whose entire job was to check what somebody was wanting to make a change to, and then make sure that they had approval to make that change. And then on the other side, we had teams of people that were trying to forensically understand what changes had happened in the environment and try and figure out whether or not those things were approved or whether there was something that had happened that was not approved. And so the problem with that is that you've got this massive gap in between those two things, right? Is the actual changes that get made. And so whether or not somebody makes a mistake, or whether they're actually trying to be malicious or what have you, it's not, very often the changes that are being made aren't the things that are approved, and therefore you've got these teams of people that have to go and audit it. So instead of having all of these people running around doing this kind of work and this compliance and audit work, you can just cut that out by just making sure that the changes that were actually being made were secure, and that means bringing the security team into that process.
Great, thank you. So Robert, you have recently deployed 12,000 licenses of Puppet Enterprise into your organization, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe you could describe the before and after. From a security standpoint, how is security involved with the management of production infrastructure and the delivery of software code? And then how did that change after you implemented something like Puppet?
Well, it's interesting. We had our legacy networks, our brownfield environments, and that was very traditional ITIL. You would ask for a server, it would take 4 weeks to get built, and pretty traditional. With TIAA, it's again, very process-oriented, very slow-moving, and you all know how that goes. When we decided to bring in our cloud infrastructure, we, it's funny, people are talking about this CAMS acronym, and I think we hit it because we focused on the C at this time, on the culture. So we brought in all the teams. We were, even in the solutioning process, we had security in there, we had risk in there, we had engineering and networking, and we would get in rooms and we'd just throw things on the wall. What do you need? What do you want to do? At that time, we decided that Puppet was going to be our primary orchestration piece. We used a vRealization for some orchestration pieces, but we had all these things in place that we could say, okay, this is what we're going to build and this is what it needs to be. And we implemented terms and conditions where people say, if you want to use our platform, you are going to be patched every 30 days, whether you like it or not. You are going to, we had a governance layer, an infrastructure layer that had all of our compliance layers that, Puppet, we called it our globals in HIRA, and it just got applied. The dev people couldn't even change it if they wanted to. It was just going to be enforced. So we were able to establish this beforehand, and then through adoption, people were seeing that it did work. So again, a lot of the bolt-on security, we didn't have to fight that. And we're now going through into the brownfield environment, since we've vetted out these processes and starting to slowly put them into some of these legacy systems. And it's proving to be very, very effective. But the funny thing is also is that we, even our engineering teams, we think security. It shouldn't be that we're just thinking these weird conceptual things to do just because it might work. You have to think security. So I think that's where the culture comes in, is security is just yet another layer of governance that should be applied. But we should always, in the culture, be thinking of that, thinking of BCP, and we're designing, putting the stuff in. And security should just be checking the box saying, yeah, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that's kind of how we embraced it.
Great, thank you. So Sean, DevOps, squishy topic, right? Means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. How do you think security folks think about DevOps? Do you find in your work life that security people have adopted those practices and are embracing DevOps as a methodology, or do you think they're more resistant to the concept?
It's been my experience so far that they're not opposed to the concept, but it's been a bit of a slower uptake than, for instance, with the development team. I think they like the nature of being able to have a workflow where they can get integrated into the process, as opposed to some bit that has to get sort of thought about at the very end. In our environment, we don't do software development. We just build the infrastructure, the platforms, and typically our customers will either bring their own software developer. So we don't have maybe what many of you do in terms of a internal developer to ops workflow. There's sort of an inherent organizational barrier there for us. So I don't know if I have a good representation of it, but one thing we have seen is that there's a huge increase in security as something that is front and center in our customers' views in a way that it really even wasn't 12 months ago. They're asking for it. We've developed a whole new product suite around managed security, security services, specifically focusing on the audit, the compliance piece, as a sort of a dedicated business focus, as opposed to something we just did as part of the rest of the service offering. So I think the customers in general are more interested, their security teams are more interested, and having a DevOps-like workflow when we deploy the infrastructure allows us to respond to the changing security requirements, because every customer, they might need PCI, and another one might need HIPAA, and another one might need ITAR, and those are fairly well established. But in addition to that, they all have their own peculiar requirements above and beyond, or maybe in some cases they've gotten like an exception to a certain area. So we have all these little knobs we have to fiddle, and Puppet allows us to do that very predictably, very safely, and then be able to report on it very, very well. So that's been a huge gain for us, even without sort of having the developers in our DevOps workflow.
Fantastic, thank you. So Trevor, you and I go way back. I think before even DevOps as a term was invented, I'm sure Agile was probably around at that time. And we know that Jez Humble discussed in the kickoff this morning that the government is trying to implement more Agile and DevOps type methodologies. You do a tremendous amount of work, as you mentioned earlier, with the federal government. How have you seen the adoption of DevOps within that large organization created back in 1789, which was a good point that Jez made this morning, relatively young country. But and I think he was trying to make a point there because he's English. But anyways, so what do you think? What do you think the role of security is in terms of DevOps and Agile and the government? And how have you seen Puppet, but maybe other solutions or other tools that can be utilized in that process? How have you seen them streamline the delivery of software delivery? And has it worked?
Well, I mean, we all know that newer is better, so we win, right? But so the federal government's an interesting place. It's basically the largest company in the world. And effectively what I've seen across a lot of different agencies is they go through the exact same problems as large businesses, but their fundamental goals are very different. A business is out there going, I need to make a lot of money. Like my goal is to add value, provide things to customers, and make money. But every government organization's mission is completely different. From a security point of view, they have very large tomes of security compliance documentation, and from our point of view, we thought that Puppet was the right solution to implement those compliance frameworks. So with different customers, what we're seeing is, I guess I think I've never seen a more waterfall Agile than in the government, if that's fair. They're really trying, they want to go Agile, but the contracting models just aren't set up for it. So fundamentally, as much as they're pushing it, very, very small teams can very effectively do Agile in the government. The larger the program gets, and especially once you become a program of record, you're pretty much guaranteed to be waterfall from then on out. So the best thing you can do, or the best thing I've seen anyway, is that as projects start small, they adopt a very solid and set Agile workflow. And they incorporate all the different organizational facets into it. So they'll pull in security, they'll pull in operations and upper management. And the ones that I've seen be most effective are honestly where everyone but the very top tier is part of the CI workflow. So you start your CI workflow, and we actually took some organizations and said, hey guys, security guys, we want you to write code. We want you to sit down and write code to check the systems. It's like, well, we can't do that. Okay, can we get new security people? And amazingly, they did. So they took developers and said, hey, you guys like security, come over here and write this. And you security people, we're going to cut you down to 2 people, and you're just going to be mapping policy into these security checks. And it worked really effectively 2 ways. The first way was you actually had good developmental checks in this workflow. The second way was those security people that got let go actually learned how to write the code to do the checks. But I mean, effectively, everybody in the organization is becoming part of the development workflow, because the development workflow is actually what's driving mission and business at this point from a government point of view. So I think it's getting to be effective. I think there's a long way to go, especially when you go from the more technical agencies down to the less technical agencies. And but I think the Puppet environment has actually been a very good game changer for a lot of these places, because it's well understood, well known, and works with a lot of the software that they already have.
I think it was really interesting. You said the security folks are writing code now in order to be able to, I guess, model their security requirements and then allow Puppet to enforce that, right?
Yep.
Is it Puppet code that you're referring to? Or is
they're writing Puppet code. They're also writing a lot of open SCAP or SCAP code, code XML. But they're writing a lot of SCAP XML, and they're modifying that and tailoring it to their environments so that they can actually do these checks in a standardized manner. And more importantly, they're starting to share. They're getting out on GitHub. They're actually pushing things out. They're becoming much better about making sure that other parts of the government can reuse this material.
That's fantastic. That's encouraging, actually. So I'll open that up to the rest of the panel, actually. Are there any other security teams actually writing Puppet code at this point, or code that maps to the Agile workflow within your organizations? Not yet.
Our team occasionally will write some
Really? Okay.
scripts and checks and things to automatically be able to check and enforce security compliance. I don't have a great insight to what they do, but I do know that they do it.
Okay.
So,
Fantastic.
and they have gotten particularly excited about doing more with our Puppet infrastructure recently, as they've seen and become aware of the rich amount of data that is in the system. So I expect them to leverage that quite a bit more and possibly even do code for our Puppet environment.
Someday. We can only hope.
Yeah, we're still seeing we're seeing some engineering ops people come into security more to try to give their insight in. And I guess we are seeing a little bit of Puppet starting to come in, working with certain compliance software that we're going to be leveraging Puppet to mitigate it once it's found. So yeah, there's a little bit starting to creep in at this point once they're getting more comfortable with it.
Great.
So we see it more along the lines of, so the financial services industry in particular, they tend to have police of the police of the police of the police. So it's an evolution to move up that stack, and it tends to be that the security teams is kind of at the pinnacle of that. So to get up into that space, you need to move through the infrastructure teams who are responsible for making the security changes that security specifies. But then there's the account management teams who sit above that, who give the permissions to the infrastructure teams to be able to make the changes that security has asked them to get. And you sort of get the picture here. It's kind of a cascade effect. So part of the whole sort of DevOps initiative is to try and squash all that back down into a sensible group of people who are there, who know what they're doing, and can ensure that they've got the right level of security on their application changes.
Great. So the next topic that I've got is compliance. I've been selling compliance software, security software, Puppet for 15, 17 years. And one of the things that I've always found interesting is when asking individuals within your types of organizations what compliance means to them, beyond security, audit, what have you. I never get a very specific answer. So now that I've got a captive audience, I'm going to ask you for some specifics. When we say compliance, for example, within your organization, Scotiabank, what does that mean exactly? What types of, what do you need to prove What do you need to have to prove compliant systems?
So first step is that somebody needs to write a standard to be compliant with, and so often the regulators will say that there is a requirement for a standard in this space, and then there will be a team internally who will then be given the job to write that standard to meet the compliance of the regulators. And then the next step, again, this comes down to this police model. The next step is that then someone has to prove that the team is actually following the standard that someone's written based on the requirement for a standard that came from the regulators. So the compliance is really about, if there is a standard, do we actually meet that standard, and how do we ensure that standard is being provisioned? I sort of mentioned at the beginning, and this I guess comes back to that scanning thing. Banks tend to go around having a lot of scanning that goes on after the fact, just to see, has anything changed? Has anyone messed with this? Whereas when you can leverage tools such as Puppet to be able to bring that into the development process, so that actually people can't make changes unless those changes are approved. And then if you trying to make changes, a tool like Puppet can then fix those changes. So you don't have to have this. It just cuts out all of this audit and scanning processes around trying to detect compliance breaches.
Great.
Yeah, that was something that we did as the initial rollout of our platform. Is before the first service put on, we had a SOX compliant Puppet module that was put in, and from day one, every 30 minutes, it runs and it fixes. So, and it's put into what we called our global infrastructure. So even if you get a team who wants to circumvent it, they can't undo it. So it's that was one of the things. You don't want to step on the development. So, we implemented this. That was, it enforced TIAA policy, but it still allowed them the leverage to do what they needed to do without compromising anything. So, again, it's worked very effective, and it's something that you couldn't just bolt on into the legacy environments. So as people are migrating into the new platform, more and more things are falling into compliance, and it's much more easier to enforce. And then it's reported on,
Well, yeah, and along that line. So how do you demonstrate that compliance? Is it actually showing the Puppet manifests? Is it allowing them to inspect the end systems?
Yes, so we leverage a lot of Puppet facts because Puppet facts can be pushed into PuppetDB, and we can ingest that into Splunk, and you can report on these kind of things. So as long as the system is in compliance, we're happy. But the moment something's flagged, it can trigger something. Someone can go back in the logs, or where they're going, and see what exactly. But yeah, all the manifests, all the logs, all that stuff is being collected, and it's just using technology to make things a little bit easier.
John, did you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I would echo what Seamus had said about the understanding the standards, having those defined, not just standards in terms of what permissions need to be on a file, but also the standards about the process, about who is allowed to make changes, when they're allowed to make changes, how they're allowed to make changes, what sort of review process that has to go through. Having sort of a DevOps approach to infrastructure has helped us greatly, because all of the changes that we drive through Puppet are in Git. And so we have this nice visibility in being able to pull up a list of all of the changes that are marked with the ticket numbers that they're associated with. So you can go back and track the approvals through the ITIL system where that was entered by the customer or the internal team that needed the change. You can see exactly what was changed. So you get the, at the end of the day, you get the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. So that's very important as well. A level of visibility that you could get before, but I think it was a lot harder to go through the system logs and try to kind of piece together the mystery about how these things happen. And even after all of that, often you never had the why. The commit message gives you the opportunity to put the why in there. So as long as you're holding the users of the system to the standard of making sure that they're putting good, clean commit messages in, that fills in the missing piece there. So I think the version control is a huge benefit into the process piece of compliance in a workflow like this. And I think auditors, especially now that they're starting to become more familiar with tools like Puppet and that concept, are really looking for that sort of reviewability and to be able to excuse me, confirm that you can see like a peer review in a merge request, that one person pushes the commit, somebody else has reviewed it, and it clicks apply. So you actually, it's not a, hey, asking them, did you review it? You can actually see in the workflow of getting the change from where it was initially committed up to whatever your production branch is to push it out. That is important, and in our environment at least, there's also interest in making sure that the teams who write the code have a review process over the people who use the code, so they can submit patches, but you still have to make sure you go through that review process, and to be able to show all of those different lines of sort of checks and balances to prevent a bad actor from doing things is very important and interesting in that world.
Trevor, I imagine the government has armies of auditors that audit your systems.
There's one or two. Actually, this is definitely a subject that's near and dear to my heart. As I mentioned, I'm the lead on the SIM framework, and it's designed for the federal government, and it is open source. But the perspective we took on this was, obviously, we all know the federal government has more regulations than pretty much anyone. But one of the interesting things is that as we started mapping our framework into HIPAA in particular, we started reading the new HIPAA documents and went, wait a minute, what is this? The HIPAA documents are now referencing the NIST 140-2. So HIPAA references NIST 140-2. NIST 140-2 references the FIPS 140-2. Sorry, NIST 853. Wrong NIST docs. But NIST 853 references the NIST 140-2, but it also references common criteria. So all of a sudden, HIPAA inherited all of the federal government unclassified system regulations. I'm like, well, this is pretty amazing, because we went, okay, so how do we actually look at this? So yes, I completely agree that the commit change logs and the tracking back to requirements is absolutely key to proving intent. And on the other hand, getting things into a data analysis system is also very important. Now, one of the things we found when we were making the framework is we implemented as many of these policies as we could find. And we didn't just implement the compliance part. We went and said, what's the actual intent? What is the security that we're supposed to put into here? So we went above and beyond and said, you know what, let's go ahead and turn on all of it. Everything we can find, turn it all on. One of the things I found is that the security teams were really happy to go scan things. It's like, we will happily run around and scan things and scan everything. You can't scan my systems. You have to actually unharden my systems to scan them, which of course we won't do. So now, how do we actually convince the auditors that our systems are secure? And so this is where actually we wrote a open source plugin to Puppet that allows you to map intent inside of your ENC, inside of the Puppet console, or inside of HIRA. And the idea here is that per policy body or per internal policy body, you can actually tell if the HIRA data or ENC data that was applied to your Puppet system as it compiles is what the policy says it should be. And it'll give you a report on that as things move forward. And so this can be fed back into PuppetDB, or it can be placed on the server for analysis later. So we're now looking at the kind of the next level of it. It's like, it's not just the policy, it's not just the scans. It's now a combination of custom SCAP for your environment, combined with now intent level diagnostics, which you can only do with Puppet because it's a compiled system. So I'm excited about it.
So that's actually there's a very, very interesting and challenging point in there as well, is around the people wanting to get access for security purposes. So I need to check this for security purposes, and you're like, I'm not letting you in because that's a security issue for me. So that whole point of unhardening things to let the security people do their job is also, it's just defeating the whole purpose of the process, right? So,
Catch-22. So, Robert, you actually touched on brownfield deployments, but I'm going to turn it over to Seamus, and we'll kind of go back through, and then we'll open it up for questions to the crowd. So new processes, new applications, new systems, implementing DevOps, Agile. You know, it's easier to kind of start fresh and do everything right the first time, right? But when you think about actually implementing security and compliance and trying to automate that within a brownfield environment, what does that look like to you?
Very slow. And a perfect example is we wrote our auto patching module. So we have a single pane of glass that all the application owners have access to, and they can set their maintenance windows, and patching is going to occur, and reboots are going to happen. And it's worked with a hitch. We patch, thousands of servers, and not one person ever touches the system anymore, and it just works. So then they're like, wow, this is great. We need to start putting this into brownfield because no one's having to touch this. We have whole teams that are patching. So again, it's because we've been able to vet it out in production systems for years, you have some confidence now in the process. And again, what someone had said, actually, I think Sanjay said this morning, we started out deploying Puppet Agent everywhere, so we do the roles and profiles. So our brownfield environments basically just reported data. So we've always been collecting metrics on this stuff. And now we have an opportunity to start slowly moving pieces into it to start complying with patching and other security things. So yeah, it's slow. Hopefully the goal is to, on server refreshes and things that you're moving into the new environment. So we're trying to tackle it from both ends, but you definitely got to move cautiously.
Seamus?
So actually, it's a really simple thing like patching, and this is something that's sometimes very important to communicate to the executive level of an organization, is that people have sort of come to terms with, oh, well, patching just takes half an hour to patch a server because that's just how long it takes. One of the big eye-opening discussions is to talk about, out of that half an hour, which is crazy, do you know how much of that time is just complying with security concerns? Right. So for example, most organisations you can't, so in financial services organisations they have concepts of break glass. So if you want to be able to go in and do some patching on a server through SSH, you have to go and get the password for that because you don't have that password. So you need to go and check out the password. You need to be able to provide a reason of why you're doing this thing. And so there's all of these little activities that happen around this to be able to enable somebody just to go in and do the patching. And that's what takes up the bulk of the time on this patching. It's not so much the actual activity itself, even though that shouldn't be done manually. But if it is, it's actually the security compliance concerns that take up the most amount of time. And so that's where we've seen sort of I've seen the biggest gains. And so sort of examples of this is sort of if you've got, say, an organisation of 10,000 IT professionals. I've seen privilege access requests getting to sort of 60,000 a month. And that's just people wanting to go and, so that's 60,000 times of people going and putting in their reason why they need a password, then checking the password out, and all of this activity that goes into that, so that they can then get on and do their actual job. And so it's just it's a mind-boggling amount of effort that goes into all of this, and it gets swept away once you've got a model that kind of makes sense.
Sean, did you want to win?
Yeah, I agree completely, actually, with both of your points. Because security, there are those requirements, I think that makes the automation, DevOps tooling like Puppet very, very important because it helps return the time back that you would have spent. Maybe if you don't have to log into every box and go through those hoops, you get that time back so you can spend it on more interesting things. And on the brownfield deployment, I just wanted to highlight that I think the no-op feature in Puppet is wonderful because we do get a lot of inherited sort of brownfield systems where, for whatever reason, they need to sort of stay where they're at, but we start needing to make changes or applying certain compliances over time. You can go in there and with the no-op feature, Puppet will tell you exactly what it's going to do to the system so you can sort of bring a higher thought to it and say, all right, well, what would this do? How is this going to maybe affect the application? You can have discussions with the application team to figure out, you think this is going to be okay, or is this going to be incorrect? But it provides a complete list of what is not in sync with what you need to be there. And the other thing with brownfield is, again, in our environment, we inherit these systems sometimes from companies where we can't even talk to the team that was managing them originally. Those people are, gone, or they've been moved off to different duties. So you don't even have a good sense, in some cases, of the systems in a given environment. Like, does dev actually match QA? Does it match prod? So you can't even just assume in a brownfield environment that you can apply these, and if it works safely on dev, that it's going to work just as safely in prod, depending on what sort of a brownfield environment that you are coming from. So the no-op modeling is crucial in that environment. But it is time-consuming, and it's one of those things where you have to look at it and say, is the time I'm going to invest in doing this effort of trying to bring a brownfield system into compliance, Is that going to be a return? And I would say in most cases, yes, it's going to be, because you've got the security requirements. You don't want to miss on an audit because something wasn't applied properly on one of these brownfield systems. And then you also get, and there's a lot of overlap between security and consistency. I mean, a lot of security is having consistency according to the right policy. But security aside, consistency is incredibly important for IT in general. I mean, anybody who's been doing IT understands that if you have consistency, you have predictability, which helps you not be up at 3 in the morning, dealing with outages and issues and unexpected events. So by going back into a brownfield environment and trying to apply a more procedural tooling with like Puppet, or really any automation tool, the closer you can get that brownfield to whatever your current standard is, the more consistency you're bringing into the system, the better overall your operations are going to be, including security, but all aspects of the IT operations.
And I do want to make sure that we've got enough time to answer questions, but did you have anything in particular? I mean, you've got blackfield environments, you've got air-gapped environments, you've got tanks and helicopters.
Actually, it was interesting, just very briefly. We did consulting recently for an insurance company, a bank, state government, and the federal government, and we found the exact same problem in all the brownfield environments, just fear. It was just fear. It was, what is this going to do to my environment? Like, how is my application going to run? My developers are afraid. I can't patch, I can't update, I can't do anything. And I'm sitting here going, you can build a box in 10 minutes and try it. Just try it. If it doesn't work, you have, absolutely, just say we can't do it, fine, exclude that node. But 9 times out of 10, it'll work fine. I think that's really the biggest point that I found is, cultural fear is just high with brownfields.
Yep, you see that everywhere. Okay, so I think we got about 8 or 9 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to the crowd for questions.
Hi, I'd like to hear some thoughts about how you feel that stateless systems will impact our jobs as security professionals moving into the future, because it feels to me like everything that we do today is based upon stateful environments and that we don't like change. So I'd like to hear how we anticipate that making our jobs different in the future.
I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah, please.
So, disclaimer, I'm not in an environment with a lot of stateless systems, but I think that's where, to the earlier discussion point about having security sort of integrated with that DevOps workflow, it's very important that security reviews how those systems get built. What's the process? Whatever you're using to bake it to the thing that gets deployed, it's important that you're in that process as a security professional, make sure that those are being hit, because there is state until you release the system. Whatever that build image is the state of that system.
Actually, I'd love to follow up. I am working with some stateless systems, and what I see happening is stateless systems aren't new. Ever since Unix was a thing, we were using named pipes to just shove stuff everywhere. So that was a stateless system on one machine. The issue is to correctly actually identify a stateless system, you're going to have to start to apply functional programming applications to it, and you're going to have to start mathematically proving that that stateless system is in fact stateless. And if you can't do that, I wouldn't accredit it.
Great question. Thank you. Anyone else?
You mentioned compliance and your background in Tripwire. And so one of the things, Tripwire is scanning the entire system, looking for unauthorized changes. And, with Puppet, you're really, you're guaranteeing compliance against changes that you made.
Everything you're watching,
so what do you guys use then, or do you see all your changes being made with Puppet on the entire system? Or do you think another tool like Tripwire or UpGuard or one of these other competing products is still necessary?
That's a good question, and certainly if there are any Puppet TSCs in the room, you can jump in at any point. But that is one of the limitations of using Puppet exclusively for security is that it does not, for example, it manages resources primarily, right? It can certainly manage and check some files, but it doesn't do that by default. You can have it, recursively go through file systems and all that kind of stuff and try to make it behave like Tripwire. but it doesn't do a great job at that, and it doesn't do a great job with reporting. So, from our perspective, of course, we would suggest using Puppet to manage as much as you possibly can on a particular machine in order to make sure that it is compliant as possible. And then, the main problem with Tripwire is that to establish a known good state, you took a snapshot of a system, and you had to hope that it was in a secure state. And then when Tripwire ran, it would tell you what changes were made, but it doesn't tell you whether or not those are good changes or bad changes, and you had to remediate those systems back to the known good state by yourself, by hand. They claim to have an ability to do that from tape backup, but it never really worked very well. So, I think it's a great question because Puppet is part of the answer from a security perspective, but I certainly wouldn't say that's a complete answer. Does anybody else have anything to say?
I would actually love to answer part of that. The disastigs actually dictate the use of aid on systems. But if, at least for Linux systems, if you so there's the integrity management architecture, which is part of a kernel level, basically a kernel level tripwire. But if you actually enable the auditing subsystem of both Linux and Windows correctly, you can use Puppet to manage those critical components in your system that you really need to keep correct, and of course keep your services running and whatnot. But you can then use the reporting aspects of these kernel level functionalities to report on every anomaly that comes through your system, including who did it, what time, and potentially what they modified if you're getting into shell level auditing and recording.
And another angle that you could use is on, for instance, an RPM-based system. It has checksums of all the files, so you can run a report complete of every file that RPM has deployed. It's of course not every file on the system, but it does cover all the critical binaries that are part of the OS, and it will tell you if any of them have been modified in terms of ownership and permission. So I think there's definitely a place for multiple tools, working to their strengths to get a complete picture of the system.
Yeah, one of the demos that we showed today in the latest version of Puppet Enterprise, Michael, you can correct me if I'm wrong, since I've been out of town pretty much for the last 2.5 months. But the latest feature in the UI allows you to identify intended change versus unintended change as well, and to inspect those elements and changes. If Puppet reverts it back to the known good state, was that intended change or was it unintended change? And then you can investigate those for security vulnerabilities. And that's a feature that's been asked for I would say many years. Yeah.
For the people in the room who are not security and compliance professionals but need to communicate the value of DevOps and Puppet in particular to their security and compliance professionals, what's the one thing from each of you that they need to say to people like you?
Good question. Seamus?
The one thing.
Should we skip to the end? Trevor, do you want to?
Sure.
We'll go right to left.
So for me, it's all about locking everybody out of the system. So you don't give anyone the keys. No one's got access. Everybody's locked out. There's not a security person in the world that doesn't want to have that conversation, because that is the ultimate of security. Is if no one has access, nothing bad can happen. Well, to a certain extent. Yeah.
So the question is,
what was the one thing you would tell a security professional that would convince them to use Puppet to achieve DevOps or
at least have the next conversation and continue to do so?
Right.
boy.
Remediation.
Yeah, again, I think it still goes back to shared ownership. It's not about siloing security versus thing. It's about ownership of an application, and you shouldn't really even. It's unfortunate you have to have that conversation to have a them versus us, because we should all be thinking that way. So, how do you get there? I don't know. It's a cultural adoption. Yeah. It's funny because we marketed, we got the culture by marketing our brand, and you're getting, instead of it just what we developed, it became something that everyone had a part in. We gave jackets and things out, and it became a brand that everyone wanted to get behind, and it was was something that everyone had a part in. So I think that's how you turn some of the culture in that.
I know you asked for one thing, and I can't pick one, so I'm going to give you two. The consistency angle, and consistency through the automatic remediation with the converged model that Puppet brings. The other one is, like I talked about earlier, the visibility with the change history in Git. I think bringing up the visibility where a lot of times those sorts of things were hard to detect or lurking in the shadows in a really big organization to try to track all of that. I mean, you get all the reporting and it feeds through, but to be able to see it that concisely, I think is very valuable, and that's where I would start with that conversation.
Well, I was basically going to say what he was going to say, but so I'm going to change it quite slightly and say there might happen to be, close to 100 modules on the Forge that happen to be mapped to 6 or 7 security policies already, and you can reuse that and get your consistency and actually get proof that you are actually applying these policies correctly across all of your infrastructure in a way that will that will shorten your actual time to market. That's a horrible idea. That's good.
Well, it's what I'm trying to pitch, because it's a problem where a security team is adversarial to DevOps.
Yes.
Right? And so my first pitch that I'm thinking about trying is, 1, you're doing it wrong. 2, what I'm doing can help make your job easier. And 3, take a look at Syscat, right? Prove to me that this is non-compliant, right? Put it back in their court.
Yep.
Great.
If I can add one thing just to put a bow on that, one of the things that we found in this year's State of DevOps report, which I know Gene Kim and Jez Humble talked a little bit about this morning, is that because they integrate security teams earlier on in the software delivery lifecycle, we found that high-performing DevOps teams this year actually spend 50% less time remediating security issues than their lower-performing peers. So I think it's about, to your guys' point, creating that sense of shared ownership, that this is actually going to be beneficial at freeing up more time and making our systems more predictable and reliable as a result.
Very true. All right. Any other questions? I think we've run out of time. Oh, sorry, there's a question over here. No? Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. Please, round of applause for the panelists.